So, hello. Today we're going to do another review, this time of two Stephen King, possibly novellas. They are now available, at least in Germany, as separate books, but I understand that they were both part of anthologies when they first came out. So the first one is called um, The Body, which was published in 1982 in the collection Different Seasons. And the other one is The Mist, which was published in 1980 in the anthology Dark Forces. Now, both of them have been turned into movies. The first one, The Body, was turned into a film called Stand By Me, starring um, Will Wheaton and River Phoenix, by Rob Reiner. And the other one was turned into a movie in 2007, starring Marcia Gay Harden as Mrs. Carmody. And I don't remember anything else about the cast or who made that movie, because everybody else in the cast is pretty forgettable. It's a good movie, but the cast is completely forgettable. Nobody remembers any of these people. I'd never seen them before, and I haven't seen them since. And I'm not even sure if this one wasn't actually a made-for-TV film. It could be. So let's start with the older of the two. So The Mist was written in, well, probably in 1979. It was published in 1980. So it's one of Stephen King's first decade of publishing works, as it were. And if I were to categorize it, I would call it creature horror. um, with a lot of interpersonal panic dynamic. It's again a typical King with regard to the fact that it's set in New England. We've also got somebody named Billy or Big Bill. He's a child, and he and his dad basically end up in a really bad situation. Um, and what happens is there is a huge storm that sweeps across this part of New England, and the family of Bill um, lives by a wonderful lake, um, and they have this wonderful house. And Billy's dad is a painter, quite a good one, who sells at this stage mainly paintings for, well, advertising purposes. But his father was such a successful painter that he made a lot of money with it, and one of his paintings is actually in the White House. Now, Bill and his father and his mother live by that lake, and there is this huge storm which takes out the power. It fells lots and lots of trees. And when they wake up the next day, because they spend the evening in the basement, the power goes out. It's all terrible. But this is really just, if you like, the prologue of events to come. When they come out the next day, their house is largely in ruins because they've got this huge panoramic window which has been completely smashed. The boathouse has been smashed. Their car is fine, but they can't really get anywhere because all of the trees on the road into the town have been felled. So what they need to do is they first need to clear those trees. So David gets out a chainsaw and starts clearing those trees. And his neighbor, who we learn is a very successful solicitor, attorney, or I assume if this was England, he would be a barrister because he actually goes to court to argue cases. And they had a run-in and a law dispute previously. One of the trees actually fell on his really beautiful car, apparently, and smashed it to pieces completely. And they make a decision that they need to go into town. They need to buy some supplies because they don't know how long this is going to last for. And at the moment, they may not be able to travel further than the nearest town. So uh, David and decides, and or his wife tells him to go into the town that is closest to them and get some stuff from the grocery store. So he takes his boy, Bill, and also their neighbor with whom they had had this legal dispute a year earlier, and who is somebody who basically just comes there for the summer months or for the summer weekend. So he doesn't really live locally. And they basically get into the car, but what they also see is that the Long Lake is being slowly covered by a kind of what looks like mist. But David is kind of a bit worried about this or skeptical or a bit kind of like, there's something wrong with this mist because it is drawn with a ruler. So it's kind of like a really sharp edge that is basically, it's like a wall that is coming towards and across the lake towards the houses. So he's like, that's not a normal mist if I've ever seen any mist. But, they basically go into town. The last thing that he sees of his wife is she's sitting or she's kneeling in the garden, basically taking out some root vegetables or something, to prepare dinner. And they arrive in the town in this very, very large grocery store. And this is a grocery store that's almost like a little shopping mall onto itself. So there's this huge car park. There's also a pharmacy next to it, but it's this huge, huge low building, the ones that are really wide and very deep and have like these glass, huge glass windows at the front. And of course, they don't have any electricity, so all of the doors have to be moved by hand because they've got these automatic doors. Even in the 1980s, they had them, and they basically are full of people, the shops, because obviously, or this shop, because people are now starting to buy everything because they're afraid that something may happen. They don't know when they can leave. There is no electricity. Phones are down, so it's all terrible. And if anybody is reminded of something that happened in 2020 when people were suddenly starting to buy all kinds of things, I understand that people really liked to shop for pasta and toilet paper. I didn't shop for either of these things, but apparently that was a big thing. And so everybody's doing the same thing. And as they are in that shopping mall, you again get or grocery store, you again get the full King treatment because King is super at describing people and at characterizing people. And everyone in the supermarket that has a name or even just is described facially has a character that you can relate to. These are people you know. Um, Tom, Dick, and Harry, they're all there. People you know, the annoying neighbor, the caring neighbor, the old school teacher who basically has taught everyone in primary school who's now somewhere and someone in this village or in this town, the religious nutter, and so on and so forth. They're all there. And then the mist starts closing in, and then somebody goes outside with a couple of people because they want to go home. They're like, this mist, I need to go home. And you hear a scream. And then one of these people who ventured out runs back and he said, something's in the mist and it took my friend. So now you have this thing, okay, there's something in the mist. They close the doors, or well, the doors are hardly ever open. You have to push them open manually. So they make sure that they're closed. Everybody's like, what is going on? What is this? What happened? What took him? Well, I don't know. There was something there and I heard his screaming and now he's gone. And of course, now you have people starting to fall into different groups. There's the group that wants to stay. There are some who say they need to go. There's this one lady who says, I need to go home because my two kids, 8 and 5 years old, or 8 and 3 years, are home alone. I need to go home. They're home alone. I need to be there. And she basically then goes around and says, is there nobody here who will accompany a woman home? It's like this, is there no one here who will take a lady home? And of course, David is there with his son, and his son is like 7 or 8. So he's like, well, I can't, I've got a child with me, blah, blah, blah. But nobody actually volunteers. And so she steps outside and vanishes in the mist. Um, and things get worse because people don't want to go outside, and suddenly, you know, um, things are going downhill because they need the generator for the huge um, refrigerating systems that they have. So they go into the side room that contains the generator, and they notice that something's blocking the um, the exhaust outside. So and then they decide that somebody needs to go outside. But David says, well, please don't, because we don't know what's out there. Something has happened. And they're like, no, nothing's happened. Don't just, be an old man, as it were, stupid. And basically, they go outside, or one of them goes outside, and in come those huge tentacles. So now we know this is creature horror. There are huge tentacles that come in. There is this little guy. He's 18. He's the errand boy, and he gets basically taken by those things. And they shut the door on the tentacles and they cut one off. So there is proof now. There is evidence that there is something. Now, in the movie, interestingly enough, after a while, the tentacle dissolves. It doesn't in the book, it stays there. So anybody who wants to can get evidence. They might say, okay, this is rubber and this is funny, but if you want to, there is evidence. And then over the next pages, this is the bulk of the book, describes how the first night happens, because then suddenly those insect-like beings fly against those huge windows, and they are then hunted by huge bat-like creatures. And basically then it becomes horrific because they are locked in there. Well, not really locked. They could leave if they wanted to, but it's also going to be quite dangerous because these things are out there. Plus, you have the interpersonal horror that King does so well. In this case, the character that is most horrific is Mrs. Carmody, who is a religious nutter who believes that now this is kingdom come, the apocalypse is here, the harrowing of hell is just around the corner. And she manages to incite religious fervor in people and saying, well, we need to pray, but then at some point praying isn't enough anymore. We need a blood sacrifice. So it's all spiraling out of control. And then there are groups that decide to venture out, they die. It becomes quite apparent that they're dead. Um, and in the end, on the second night, David and a couple of his friends decide that they're going to leave the next day. They're not going to stay. They are afraid of Mrs. Carmody's posse because she's clearly trying to get them to, you know, kill the boy, as it were, Bill, in order to appease God. And of course, David cannot accept that. So he basically, has befriended a lady whose husband and son are not, I don't know where they are. I don't know if I think her husband is actually traveling, so he's not even in the area. So the two of them have panic sex. Yeah. And then there is the old school teacher. She's kind of like a really intelligent, but also really pragmatic person. And so go they manage to get into a car and drive off into the mist, and then they see those huge creatures like taller than even a dinosaur, that are walking around on 6 legs. And when they put their feet down, basically they have to circumnavigate those footprints, because otherwise the car would go in but it would never come out again. So we're talking about something really heavy there. And underneath all of this, there is the idea that there is some kind of military installation not too far away, and apparently they've been working on a program called Arrowhead. And we're talking 1980, so this was written in 1979, was published in 1980. So that was, you know, 24 years after the first attack with an atomic bomb, or two actually, on Japan by the United States. There was also this kind of like, experiments that were happening. And it is this idea that the military is somehow behind this, and there is something going on there. And there is something that, maybe they opened a portal to another dimension or whatever. And spoilers, of course, there is no ending that is positive. They end up driving south along the eastern seaboard, and they stay the night in a hotel. And of course, they're the only humans there. There is nobody else. And David turns on the radio, and he believes that he hears a word being broadcast. And all this time, there hadn't been a single, like any reception of of any single um, radio signal or whatever. And he hears a word, and that word is Hartford, which of course is a place name, or could be a person's name as well. But probably, if I was an enclave of survivors of some kind of catastrophe, I wouldn't broadcast my name in order to attract people. I would broadcast my position. So Hartford is probably a position. And basically, the last lines read, so he goes down to his son, he gives him a kiss, and then he whispers two words in his son's ear. The first one is Hartford, and the other one is hope. And that's the end. So we don't know what happens. If you watch the movie, the ending is different, but for David at least even worse than what we find here, because we don't know what's going to happen to them. But in the movie, they run away in the car. They've got a gun. They also have the gun in the book, and they realize that there is nothing there. They're like in the middle of nowhere, there's this mist. So basically, he shoots everyone because they have one bullet too few. So he shoots the woman he's just had a panic affair with, the school teacher, and the other guy, and his son. So he kills all four of them, including his son. And he doesn't have a bullet for himself. He knows this. He gets out of the car, and then the military arrive with tanks, and they rescue him. And there's also a big truck, and on that truck, we see the lady who said, "Isn't there going to be anyone here who's going to take a lady home?" And you see her with her two children. So that's not in the book. And I remember watching the movie, and I mean, like I said, the cast is completely forgettable except Marcia Gay Harden. But I mean, she could be reading the phone book, and I would be listening. So, and she's also won an Academy Award. She's not just anyone, but the rest don't know. The special effects are terrible, except for the very last shots where these huge creatures walk around in the mist. But why are they better or good or really also frightening? Because it's the old Silent Hill thing. If you obscure something with mist and fog, you don't have to be so convincing. It's enough if you've got the shadows. And as a matter of fact, the shadows are even worse because you don't know what's there. And the other book is The Body. And this is again typical Stephen King. Number one, it's set in Maine. Number two, the protagonist is a writer and he looks back on his youth. So again, we've got the writer who's a protagonist. Three, it's a coming of age story, which apparently is very King-esque. It's the first one that I've read, except for It, which I did read in parts until I got to the part where they kill the dog. And that's also kind of a coming of age story. But I wasn't aware that this is something that King really likes doing. There are other books by King which I haven't read, which also seem to relate to this theme. Now, this is the story of four boys in the 50s. They're like round about, I want to say 10, between 10 and 12, 10 and 13. And they're friends. And they have heard that there is, that the dead body of a boy has been found who was out collecting berries, blackberries or whatever. And he was found by a railroad track somewhere. So his body's there, but it hasn't been announced to the authorities. So it's just a couple of guys from the town who know it. And one of these guys, they're like, teenagers, is the brother of one of the four. And so the four decide, as you do, let's go down the tracks. And I mean, we're talking t dozens of miles down the tracks to find that body. And I'm like, okay, that's a okay, I guess. Hmm. Um, but they also think that they can kind of like do this as a 2-day trip. And I'm like, it's 20 miles there and 20 miles back. That's 32 kilometers. I know how fast I walk. I do about 5 per hour at a leisurely pace, but I cannot keep this up for too long. I mean, if I wanted to cover this, I would have to walk 5 kilometers per hour for more than 6 hours. That's a lot. Um, the furthest I have walked was 25K and it took us 6 hours. But I mean, we did take a break, but and that was difficult terrain. And they are going to walk across difficult terrain as well because they're not going to follow a road. They're going to walk besides or close to train tracks, which they also try to steer clear of because they know that, this boy that they're looking for has been hit by a train, so they know that trains are dangerous. So I'm like, okay, I mean, maybe when you're 10 in the 50s, you and in the United States, and you're a boy, you think that this is doable. I wouldn't have thought that this is doable when I was 10. Um, uh, but okay, I mean, with a grain of salt, let's just say they aren't thinking straight, they decide to do this. Um, and then we learn about the journey and the things that they encounter. Um, and I would say, again, King is really good at creating the characters. The four boys are all damaged in different ways. So there is the protagonist, and his older brother died in an accident at a racetrack where he worked as a kind of like a mechanic or something. Um, and since then, his parents have been ignoring him. He's I mean, there's a scene where he's sitting at dinner with his parents, and he wants them to pass whatever the potatoes or whatever, and they just ignore him. And he keeps talking, and he says, "Can I have the potatoes, please? Can you pass the potatoes, please?" And they just keep ignoring him. They have this conversation with each other, and he just gets completely ignored. And apparently, this is what his life is like now since his older brother has been killed, because they simply ignore him. He doesn't matter. And his mother has turned her older son's room into a shrine. Then there's the other boy, and I'm also not going to look up the names because to me they were not memorable. I cannot even tell you what these guys were called. I think maybe one of them may have been called Chris, and he is the son of a drunk who gets beaten up and his father breaks his arm and blah blah blah. And he's a terrible person, that man. He's also got some brothers and sisters, Chris does, and they're also suffering from this guy and living in the same house as him. So sometimes he can't go to school because he's bruised and that kind of thing. And then there is the son of a World War II veteran of Normandy, and this guy has gone completely crazy. So obviously, it's we would call it post-traumatic stress disorder, and he has gone crazy. That's what people say. I would say it's probably PTSD because it was too late for schizophrenia, because schizophrenia has its onset in men a lot earlier than in this case. And he one day takes his son and puts both his son's ears to hot iron, like a boiler or something, and burns off the ears so that the son actually is almost deaf. So he has to wear hearing aids, and he's also short-sighted, so he has to wear really thick glasses. And then the fourth guy, um, I forget what his story was. Again, I have to say it wasn't really memorable. And basically, then at some point, at long last, they get to the dead body, but then they are um, almost ambushed by the teenagers from the town who have a car and who also decided to go and find the dead body. And then there's this standoff between them, and the group of younger kids says, "Oh, but we found him first, blah, blah, blah." And in the end, one of them, of the younger boys, I think it's Chris, actually has a weapon and he discharges the handgun, and everybody's shocked. And so the older boys leave. And then they return home, and don't tell anyone about the dead body after all, I think. But then they get beaten up by the older boys out of revenge, and then it ends with the fact that in a way those four friends lose connection with each other because the author is so much more intelligent than everybody else. The other two, the youngest two, they are basically just, like gonna go to the bad school, not gonna go on. I don't know what the school system was like in the 50s, but will never amount to much. Apparently, at least this is how it's depicted in the book. These are not my words. I don't think that you have to go to university to amount to anything. I think university educations can be quite overrated when I look at some of the people that I went to university with. Um, but they just end up in this kind of like working class or lower working class life. Chris actually manages to overcome the opposition of his father, who keeps telling him, well, first of all, he keeps beating him up, but also saying, well, you want to go to university, you think that you're better than me, and gives him a hard time. And ends up going to university, but then gets, or college rather, um, but then gets stabbed when he tries to persuade an attacker in a grocery store or something to put down his weapon or something. So there's an altercation and he tries to step in and he gets stabbed. And basically, he's such a good person that this is normal. And the protagonist says, that the author, well, it was clear that something terrible was going to happen to him because he's such a good person. And then, of course, you've got the author, and he is now an author of renown. He makes money with it. He's married. And Stephen King actually says this is autobiographical. This is his story. Now, I find that weird because, well, I mean, I'm not going to dispute or debate Mr. King. If Mr. King says this is autobiographical, then that's fine. But I wonder who he thinks he is in this story because um, I watched an interview with him from 1989, and he was talking about his family, and he does have a brother, that's true, but his brother is still alive, or he was in 1989. The two of them grew up together with each other in the house of their mother, who, one has to say, had been left by her husband, who basically apparently told her, I'm going to go and buy a package of cigarettes, and left and never came back. So this whole thing of his older brother dying and him not getting any love and any attention from his parents simply doesn't seem to be in his past. So I'm not quite sure, or if he's saying, yes, we went on a hike and found to find a dead body. I don't know. So I'm not really sure, because this doesn't gel with what he was telling the interviewer about his own childhood in that very lengthy interview, and where he was talking about him growing up and what it was like and stuff. There are some parts in other books where he's talking about, for example, in It, about going to the movies, how the kids go to the movies, and he's talking about the person who actually sells the tickets. And it's interesting because he references this same older lady who's selling the tickets in It without me knowing this, but he says, well, when we went to the cinema, there was this really elderly lady, and she was like wrinkled, and we called her Gojira behind her back because she looked like this thing, this monster from the Japanese movies, Godzilla or Gojira, as it's pronounced in Japanese. And so I can see parts of what he's talking about in this interview about his childhood in his work, but I can't really see it in the body. And I'm also kind of underwhelmed by it. It's not a bad book because, again, he's a great character person teller, so he's really good at that. But maybe for somebody who's born in 1973, number one, born in Germany, number two, number three is female, this whole coming of age that these four guys go through doesn't really do it for me. So I would definitely recommend The Mist if you are into creature horror. There is some horror, some creatures come in, they do kill some people. There is a fighting scene with some kind of spider-like creatures. So if you dislike spiders, then you can see how they get killed, but they also get to kill somebody from the group. Um, so definitely something that I would recommend, and it's also short. It clocks in at 200 something pages in German, so in English it will be a little bit shorter. The body, I think, I don't really know who to recommend this to, because if you come from Stephen King horror, king of horror as it were, there is no horror in this book. Um, Maybe if you were in your teens in the 1950s in the United States, in small town America, this will speak to you, maybe. Um, but again, I'm not so sure. I mean, it's for what it I mean, it's part of a collection, and I don't know the other stories in that collection. Spring, summer, autumn, and death. But it is it is just a really, I don't know. It reads quickly, but it's also forgettable. I couldn't even remember the names of the protagonists. Apparently, one of them is Geordie. Yeah. So, thanks for listening. Next up will probably be Dead Zone, which was published in 1979, I want to say. It's a novel, around 500 pages. Talk to you soon. Bye.